January 18th, 1945. A man's eyes betray his hunger. Watch the eyes recede and narrow as they probe deeply for the taste of remembered meals. An empty belly is a very basic thing. Talk concerns a rumor that we will be forced to march to the west, away from the approaching Russians. The room is cold tonight. Our fire will shortly die, and we'll retreat to our bedboards, blankets, and greatcoats. The hungry eyes will close a while.
War stories are about war. They're about heroism, about death, about cowardice, about bombing, mostly about action. This story is one of sheer human drama, perseverance against all odds. It's not the titanic clash of empires, of armies, of armor. It's a story about how for 4 years people held themselves together in the hope that somehow they would live, that they would find freedom, that they would be liberated again. And these people persevered.
January 1945. Northern Europe endures the worst winter in 50 years. Caught in the middle of this, one of the final battlefields of World War II, are 10,000 Allied Air Force officers. They are prisoners of war. And they are about to face a journey that will challenge their very determination to survive. The Nazis are desperate to keep the captive men out of the hands of the advancing liberating armies. So they plan to march the POWs out of prison onto the frozen countryside and toward the heart of a collapsing Third Reich. Robert Buckham is one of those prisoners of war. His diary and sketches of the forced march remain some of the few chronicles of this test of endurance. In 1942, Robert Buckham is an art director with a Montreal advertising agency. He heeds His Majesty's call for pilots and joins the Royal Canadian Air Force.
The general feeling I remember in this first studio I worked in was we're not going to the trenches. And of course, trenches was First World War terminology, and this was the impression that was coming in on the 20-year-olds. Causing a negative feeling for a while, for the first year. When our friends began to be killed, a difference happened in terms of attitude. And we all began to join up very quickly as we could.
For much of the war, the German forces are entrenched across Fortress Europe. The Allies' main strategic advantage is aerial attack. Day and night, the air forces of Canada, Great Britain, and the United States level demoralizing blows at the Third Reich's industrial military complex. Hitler may control the ground, but the Allies own the air over Europe. The life expectancy of a bomber crew is desperately short. Perhaps it's this knowledge that leads to their cavalier reputation. Every pilot knows that each mission is likely to be his last day alive, or his first day as a prisoner of the Third Reich.
10 trips, just 10 trips. The pilots used to say that we had paid for our education as pilots if we made 10 trips. And I never knew how true that was or not, but I knew that it was certainly going to be true in my case because I wasn't coming back.
The forced march to freedom is in fact the last leg of a remarkable journey taken by these airmen. A journey beginning on military airstrips across England. And each man remembers the fateful trip that transformed him from spirited flyer to oppressed prisoner of war.
We took off from our base in Yorkshire, and we went out immediately across the North Sea.
When I was 10 years old and in 3rd grade in church, I learned the 23rd Psalm. And I didn't fly a mission without saying the 23rd Psalm. And it gave me strength. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
We dropped our bombs and turned away, and it was then that this whole incident happened. The Germans had thrown up a bomb at me. The whole front of the aircraft was damaged. The aircraft just went like that, right up, straight up.
9 Me-109s were off to our right side, looking us over, and they suddenly came in line astern. A rocket hit our right engine, and it blew up. You can see the pistons flying out.
It was the port engine that got hit, and fortunately it was on the outside of the port engine. If it had been on the inside, it would have taken the whole cabin out.
A night fighter crept up on us. We didn't see it in time and blasted our port mortar out. I couldn't maintain height, so I gave the order to bail out.
And then suddenly you see one hit, it go down, burst into flames, and then you would try to count the number who parachuted out.
The altimeter was just unwinding and unwinding in front of my eyes like this.
It was burning pretty briskly. You've got about 200 gallons of petrol in that tank.
I saw we weren't going to make it. We were approaching the ground about 6,000 feet a minute.
So I pushed the yoke forward, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. Nothing. 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 I could do this. Well, I knew I was in trouble now.
He took one look and said, "We've got to get out of here."
I hit the bailout button twice. That means to put on your parachute. I looked back through the airplane, they were all gone.
With no experience first parachute drop, you have to make the first one count. You don't get a second run at those parachutes.
I was blown through the side of the fuselage. The nose was blown off, and Bombardier's still in there. So he just bails out, and just as he gets out, boom, the airplane blows up.
I quite honestly don't remember pulling the ripcord, but I guess I did. And then it was just a question you can't help but wonder where you're going to land.
And when it came to, my watch crystal had broken. The watch had stopped, and it was at 3:30 approximately. And so I'd been up in that tree for over 4 hours. trying to get down. I would see papieren. I was beat. I was just plain beat. I didn't fight. I didn't do anything. I just had to give in because I didn't have the strength to beat my way out of the proverbial paper bag. And that was it. And he said, "For you, the war is over," which is the mortal phrase that every POW has heard.
Robert Buckham is shot down on April 8, 1943. With other captured airmen, he's imprisoned in Stalag Luft 3, the Luftwaffe's supposedly perfect prison camp. The camp is best known as the location of the legendary Great Escape. But as the war draws to a close, Stalag Luft 3 will be the starting point for a lesser-known but greater test of a POW's fortitude.
January 22nd, our bread ration has been stopped. Thank God for the Red Cross parcels, for they assure us of tea and coffee and a daily dinner. Earlier today, the camp was shaken by a large explosion in the vicinity, arousing some concern regarding air raids in the near future. Large crowds were on the circuit today, toughening feet and legs in case the threatened forced march becomes reality.
Sagan, once a German town, is now part of Poland. Approximately 100 kilometers to the southeast of Berlin, this isolated place was the perfect location for a prisoner of war camp. Just outside the town, a scrub pine forest reclaims the land where Stalag Luft 3 once stood. The evidence of a vast containment complex for 10,000 prisoners of war slowly disappears. Because it was run by the Luftwaffe and not Hitler's notorious SS death camp unit, Stalag Luft 3 was often referred to as the country club of prison camps.
Life in the camps in general, and Stalag Luft 3 in particular, was not bad compared to some of the other camps. Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force, had decided this would be a model camp. He would show that he could run one.
It was very disciplined. When you see films, people assume that it was like a Boy Scout camp.
You know, we all have impressions of what a Stalag Luft is going to look like, or a prison camp, but it was well organized.
But despite the relatively comfortable conditions, Stalag Luft 3 is nothing more than a prison.
The food was never good, and had it not been for the Red Cross, I think things could have been a lot worse for most of us.
The packages had milk, which they called klim. They had candy, they had chocolate, they had cigarettes, they had vegetables, enough to keep them alive.
If it hadn't been for the Red Cross, I'm not saying we wouldn't have made it, but I think we'd have had a lot more casualties later on.
January 23rd. Our lunch consisted of the daily German soup ration, each cupful containing several well-boiled white maggots. Angry frustration finally surrendered to hunger, and we fished them out and ate the soup.
The greatest enemy of prisoners is boredom. When boredom comes, morale declines, and soon you have mutiny, lack of discipline, and people who will no longer take an interest in their life.
Depend on yourself. If you brooded about it and got depressed, I guess it was tough. There were some fellas that, they went round the bend, as they say,
Well, I knew that I couldn't go on forever without drawing. That was a very real part of my quest in the camp, I guess, was to express myself in drawing because there was a need for it. There was never a lack of someone to draw.
We had all sorts of walks of life there, Teachers, actors, carpenters, electricians, lawyers, doctors, you name it. So some fellas took up classes in anything you wanted.
No recreational materials were supplied by the Germans. The POWs depended on international aid groups and their own ingenuity.
Once a month we'd have a play or a band concert, It took you away from everything. So life wasn't that bad.
Another activity pursued by the prisoners of war is a game of a deadlier nature: escape.
Air Force, be it officers or personnel, always see themselves as an elite. They don't slog through mud. They don't blow their brains out with artillery fire. They're high in the sky, scarves, that dash and daring. For them, escape was almost something they owed themselves. It was forbidden by the Geneva Convention. It was forbidden by the Kommandant of Stalag Luft 3. That almost acts as a challenge. So for them to dig out, to show the enemy they're still alive, they're still an allied force, there's still life left in them, was just a task they couldn't resist.
These impressions in the earth are all that remain of Harry, one of 3 tunnels constructed for the Great Escape, the most audacious prison break of the Second World War. 250 officers plot to tunnel out of Stalag Luft 3 and disrupt the German war effort. In the months leading up to the escape, Robert Buckham forges required visas and work permits. But despite intricate planning, nothing can prepare the POWs for the circumstances of chance on that March night in 1944.
Of course, the worst thing was we were 50 feet short of where we were supposed to come out. Instead of coming out the exit in the bushes, we came out about 50 feet away, and when they found that out, it slowed up the operation considerably. They had to wait till the guard went by on his beat so we could scoot one man out.
76 Allied officers escape before guards stumble onto the tunnel. Alarms sound, the manhunt begins, and the Nazis know that there are men still in the camp who assisted with the plan.
They took us out of the hut and lined us all up, and they had machine guns all around, and they were screaming and yelling in German, and I really thought, maybe we were going to get shot there. That was the only time I was really scared.
Only 3 of the 76 men who escaped managed to return to England. The remaining 73 are recaptured at great expense and embarrassment to the Nazis. In retribution, and in defiance of the laws of war, the Gestapo systematically execute 50 of the escaped officers.
They brought them back in urns and let us bury them there. And we had a little cemetery outside the wire where they buried them. Had a formal ceremony. I have no qualms about Stalag Luft 3. except the 50 guys they shot. That set me back.
The advance guard of freedom make their touchdown on the Normandy beaches just as the sun scatters.
3 months after the daring escape came a day that brings new hope to the prisoners of war. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied troops gain a precious foothold on the beaches of Normandy. The liberation of Europe begins. The POWs at Stalag Luft III anticipate their freedom. But for Allied airmen shot down into the chaos following D-Day, capture is the beginning of a journey into hell. Not a POW camp, but the Nazi concentration camp Buchenwald.
If we'd been caught by the Luftwaffe, we'd have probably gone to prisoner of war camp. But we went right on through into Buchenwald. I was in there from August to October. We had heard we were going to be executed because they were executing some of the others. But I don't think I ever gave up. And I'm sure a lot of the others didn't either. And I've seen them bring bodies by that looked like a skeleton with skin stretched over it, and you'd see a finger wiggle. Well, you know there's still life in the body. I don't know whether they died before they hit the crematorium or not. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
The 168 Allied air officers imprisoned in Buchenwald are slated for execution by their SS jailers. Rescue for these men doesn't come from the advancing Allied troops, but from officers of the Luftwaffe, horrified that fellow pilots could be treated so barbarously.
Getting away from there helped a lot. And then we showed up at Stalag Luft III, and we were spread out then among the 4 compounds in there, and I wound up in the British compound.
Horrific reports permeate Stalag Luft III. First, the execution of escaped prisoners of war. Then revelations of the death camps and the Nazi genocide. And now, after 5 years of combat and the inevitable defeat of the Third Reich, come disturbing rumors of a forced march in the dead of winter. The illusion of gentlemanly conduct between the Allied air officer and his Luftwaffe captor fades.
Luftgangsters, air gangsters, as the German called them. Proper Minister Goebbels wants to put them in the German cities. Let the Allies bomb their own airmen. Justice. Others say, leave them to the Russians. Let the Russians take care of them. What are you going to do with them?
January 24th, the Russians have advanced to the point from which they are shelling Breslau. The persistent rumor of a forced march is now apparently confirmed, but with no positive date being given. The result has been a renewed interest in preparing pack sacks and in washing and mending clothes. This evening was occupied in sorting my drawings and paintings into 2 tin cylinders, which are hopefully waterproof. We are prepared to pack immediately.
And so it was decided that rather than let these 10,000 stay in the camp, let the Russians liberate them, keep hold of them, march them west. They are an ultimate bargaining chip.
Through the long months, the vast Russian front had been the scene of terrific drives by Marshal Stalin against the Nazi hordes. Roosevelt's "they're going to get it" declaration was echoed by a Soviet spokesman when he said, "We shall hit them as never before. They shall pay for everything."
January 1945. Russian guns firing on Nazi fortifications echo in the distance. As liberation becomes inevitable, so does the forced march.
January 27th. At 8:30 p.m., we were told to be ready to march in 1 hour. A moment of disbelief was immediately followed by a reaction verging on panic. Lockers were stripped, duffel bags were stuffed to the overflow, unpacked and packed again.
There was great panic about getting prepared, sewing kit bags together for backpacks and taking bedboards and making sleighs.
Along with many other people, I made a sledge out of a Red Cross box, which is about the size of a tea chest with no top on.
We were told to fall out, we were going to march that night. We didn't know it had. We got no preparation for that. That was a sudden move, and the weather was awful.
We older prisoners had a better handle on it than the new boys. I know, speaking for myself, I felt this winter march is going to be grim. We were used to cold weather here, and it was just the same. It was a very bitter winter. And I thought, you're going to get as far as your feet will go. They were playing for keeps.
I had a notebook that had notes in there, some photographs and drawings that were made in the camp. And I dearly wanted that thing, and I kept it close to me. But you can only carry just so much. And I actually disposed of some food in order to carry that little bit.
As we approached the gate, Red Cross food parcels were issued, 1 per man. The added weight and bulk had not been reckoned for.
A whole one would normally do your whole room for a week. And here we got this parcel, we had nowhere to put it.
January 28th. We finally left camp at 4 a.m. I was outside the wire for the first time in 20 months.
Only a few photographs of the forced march to freedom are known to exist. These images were surreptitiously taken by one of the POWs shortly after the march began.
The Germans had made absolutely no preparation for this forced march. There was no direction, there was no ultimate goal, no food, no water, no housing. They simply had chosen to keep the prisoners under their control. So they headed west, retreated deeper into Germany.
The line of march, I understand, extended about 18 to 20 miles long when we all got out of there. It took several hours for all of these men to get out. And we had 10,000 POWs in Stalag Luft 3, half-starved, inadequately dressed for the worst storm in Europe in 50 years.
There was a certain amount of, I don't like to use the word exhilaration. There was a change coming. We knew there was a change coming. I think the thing was we could see the end. Here was a positive move, that the end was in sight.
The senior burst officer gave us word that we wouldn't try to escape. He said, we better for us not to, because eventually we knew we were going to get picked up by the British, just a matter of time. For the main, we stayed together. It was safer in a group, we felt.
It was interesting to see the guards, how they changed. They became more and more terrified than we were, because they were leaving their families in Saga. And they didn't know where they were going to end up.
The guards were like 4Fers. They were the lowest of the low. They weren't fit for anything else but guard duty.
The Germans who were guarding them were either Hitler Youth, young kids 15, 16 years old who saw adventure in this, or superannuated veterans in their 60s and 70s who could hardly carry their rifles.
The actual experience of marching, I would think in the first hour or two, was an absolute pleasure because we were outside of the wire, we were breathing free air, and we were marching down the road in snow, admittedly, and it was 12 degrees below zero.
The marching was terrible. There was some snow on the ground. It was cold. And as we marched, you know, you try everything you can to make things easier.
Desperation, exhilaration, confusion. In the darkness of a German winter, the Allied prisoners of war can only depend on each other if they hope to survive.
We all formed little groups, 4 or 5 of us at a time, and if we were fortunate enough to have made a slave, we put as much on the sleigh as we could and carried the rest on our back.
And we had 4 men in there who had been in Buchenwald concentration camp, like Bill was, for 4 months. They were in a weakened condition, and we made a pact that we would watch them very, very closely.
The once coveted Red Cross packages quickly proved to be more of a hindrance than a blessing to the marching prisoners.
So what did we do? We started opening the boxes and throwing out the stuff we couldn't carry. We wasted all that food when we could have used it, you know, weeks before.
You took out the dried fruit, the chocolate, and just threw the other stuff away. And the road was just littered, and the Germans, apparently, the rear parties coming up, were just infuriated at seeing their civilians picking up this stuff.
A lot of guys were starving, and they just went in and they ate this food, and they couldn't stand it. Their stomachs couldn't handle it. They'd get sick, and they'd get diarrhea, bloody diarrhea eventually. Not everybody got bloody diarrhea, but a lot of them did, and they weren't going to make it.
I think that's the one time I really came close to giving up all kind of hope, when I decided I couldn't make it any further. And thankful for buddies, they made sure I got there.
Marching along back roads, the prisoners of war find themselves amongst a bizarre confluence of frightened humanity retreating from the vengeful Russian guns.
When the Allied prisoners marched through places such as Freiwaldau, Bad Muskau, Spremberg, they were really the last of several waves of refugees. First of all, at the approach of the Red Army, the Germans who lived in those areas fled. They threw everything they had onto a wagon, spun a horse to it, and headed west. Next, an entire wave of Jews came through their area. Those who had been evacuated from the extermination camps in Poland were now marched west also, in rags, bones, no preparation, nothing. Then came a third wave, Russian prisoners of war who had been forced labor on the farms in the east. And so by the time the Allied prisoners of war come in January 45, this is the 4th major wave of migration heading west. And right on their heels, the Red Army.
We slowly passed a farm wagon, canvas-covered, hauled by an emaciated horse. A woman's laughter was heard softly from within, rousing the blanket-wrapped driver to a terse reply. Why laughing?
I couldn't get over the fact that a woman was laughing under these circumstances, and I wondered why she was laughing.
As the expansive column of prisoners disappears into the enemy night, one question burns in all of their minds. where are we going?
January 28th, dawn arrived, and with it the icy gut ache of reality. Our line of the march was revealed ahead of us, winding to the horizon. The column trudged on throughout the endless day, covering an estimated 36 kilometers. Feet froze. Limping marchers became commonplace. We halted, finally, in the darkness of the bitter night.
We marched and we marched. When you march on dark nights, and you know you have guards out there, and you're told, don't step away from the road or we'll shoot. It's not easy to do that sort of thing.
Morale was getting low because you were hungry and you didn't know where you were going.
After 36 hours of relentless marching, the POWs are finally allowed relief from the frigid cold. The march came to a halt here in the Polish village of Przybis, today called Przewodz. That night, snow blanketed these pastures. That night, flesh froze to bone. The Nazis faced a daunting task: shelter several thousand men in a town with a population of only a few hundred.
We were shouted into a farmyard enclosed by a barn, a stable, and some small outbuildings. Following a group into the stable, I fell into the straw-covered floor, fully dressed, leaning my back against the steaming side of a reclining horse.
I wouldn't have made it. I had tremendous pain in my leg and knees, and I was just practically delirious. I'd just soon give up. I was ready to lay down just beside the road. And of course, that would have been it. But buddies, as buddies are, man, they're great. They said, no, wait, you're coming with us. And they took me right on the rest of that march into that barn.
It took a long time for them to find somewhere for us to stay. There were people outside, under shelter of the barn, who were actually freezing and getting frostbite.
I knew that something was happening. My feet, oh, so cold. Fortunately, I tried to keep things dry and warm enough so I did not get frostbite. Those are the things that you think about constantly.
Sheds, barns, stables, lofts, garages, the prisoners of war sought shelter in any building made available to them.
The church had a 500 capacity, and we were 2,000 of us. So what we did, we took turns sleeping. I know I went in, maybe the second group. We walked around outside the church. Some of them got their backs to the church, which you could radiate some warmth out of the church, and sat there. And then we finally all got to sleep there. They didn't have to put us in there. There's good and evil everywhere, isn't there? There were good people and bad. And so that's one example of good people that just let us stay in that church. Saved a lot of lives. We couldn't stay outside all night and not walk or anything, just lay down and die.
This simple act of kindness afforded 2,000 weary prisoners of war better odds for surviving the night. Years later, the American prisoners who were sheltered here commissioned this stained glass window as a symbol of their gratitude.
January 29th, our group reassembled in the barn this morning. Departure was announced to be in half an hour. Upon leaving the barn, we stumbled over an American named McLaughlin, wrapped in a frozen blanket. Semi-conscious, he mumbled only a few words, but appeared to be traveling solo. We fed him hot coffee and lashed him onto the top of our laden sled. The march began.
On this one occasion, we were going through this small town, and here was a German woman with a kettle of hot boiling water, giving it to the boys because we had instant coffee. And one of the guards came up to her and said, "Do you know who these people are?" And they used to call us the Luft gangsters. And she said, he said, "Instead of giving it to them, you should be giving it to us." And she said, "If I can't give it to the prisoners, I'm not giving it to you." And I saw her dump the whole works on the ground.
The march trudges westward, deeper into the frozen countryside. After the POWs cover a distance of 60 kilometers over 2.5 days, they're granted a full day of rest here in the town of Muskau.
January 30th, we arrived at Muskau about noon. We were directed through a large stone and iron archway, which in turn led us into the stable yard of the Castle von Arnhem. I discovered a small room at the rear of the horse stall. It contained a 4-legged bathtub with a hot water system and a floor large enough to sleep 8. The first bath in years. 8 men in various stages of undress, reclining, standing, voices raised, periodically obscured by clouds of steaming hot water gushing from the faucet. A happy, humid hell.
Regenerated, Robert Buckham grows curious of his new surroundings. Sensing relaxed security, Buckham cannot resist the opportunity. Not escape, but a simple walk. To stroll unguarded, unthreatened, a free man, even if only for a little while.
Evening, the same day. I decided to approach a house and barter for food. A knock on the door brought a teenage boy who promptly called his mother. We exchanged cigarettes for bread while attempting further conversation. They appeared to be quite friendly.
Initially, the Germans were too afraid to talk to us or fraternize with us. And if they did, the guards were pretty ruthless.
Da kam mir ein Amerikaner.
An American came up to me and asked whether it was possible to get some nails in order to build a sled. Thereupon I returned to my shop and got some steel nails and gave them to him. He spoke relatively good German, I would say. Naturally, I received cigarettes in return. And in that way, I first learned to smoke. Those were my first cigarettes.
Das waren meine ersten Zigaretten.
Some of those Germans were kind and gave us hot soup. And some fellas got a hot wine even to drink.
Wenn man da zurückdenkt, aber ich meine, das war die damalige Propaganda.
It was the propaganda of that day, Goebbels' propaganda, that the Jews, the Russians, and the Poles were subhumans. But the Americans were never referred to in those terms. For that reason, they were not seen by us as the enemy.
The Allied prisoners traded chocolate, cigarettes. Cigarettes were the currency of 1945, and they bartered their way across North Germany, begging everywhere a little hot water, a piece of vegetable, a piece of bread.
There's another woman who stood and she was crying. She said, "They are so young." You know, we'd been portrayed as, I guess, air pirates or whatever they wanted to call us. And she was, and some of our fellows were quite young, you know, 18, 19. And she was crying. She said, "They are so young." It was very touching.
January 31st, I returned to the house which had proved so hospitable yesterday. I asked if some beer, wine, or schnapps was available for trade. To my surprise, the mother returned with a bottle of Jamaican rum and proceeded to pour me a large glass. I drank it down during the next quarter hour.
The rest period over, the Germans announced departure. The freedoms experienced at Muskau are fleeting, and Robert Buckham grows ill. Disease is an enemy altogether different from the one he faced in the skies over Europe or behind the barbed wire of Stalag Luft III.
February 1st. Although experiencing waves of nausea throughout the day, I packed and was ready for departure at 9:30 p.m. An air raid alert created a delay. Thoughtful time, for we are leaving behind the assurance of warmth and shelter and facing the uncertainty of the conditions on the road ahead.
Day 5 of the forced march sees the Arctic conditions give way to warmer temperatures. The change in weather, while welcomed by the Allied prisoners of war, now poses new obstacles. The hastily built sleds are almost useless, and disease percolates throughout the column.
February 1st. We marched out in ragged order. The roads were barren of snow and pocketed with slush-filled puddles. The weather had become extremely mild. I began to sweat freely. Warmth rapidly turned to fever, then to chills. Nausea hit me again, and I vomited. I slumped by the roadside. My group pulled to the side, and a hurried decision was made. I was to wait for the sick wagon.
John Crozier helped me, and I dropped down to the side of the road, and John said he would stay with me. And the guard hit him over the head with his rifle, and John had to move on. God bless him.
I sprawled there, leaning against my pack as the entire column passed me by. Half an hour, longer. Time meant nothing. I remained there motionless until the reality of the situation took form within me. I must rejoin the column. The longer I delayed, the worse my situation.
I saw some terrible things. I saw fellows huddled on the ground, some just laying there, and no, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't stop. You had to stay with your group.
February 2nd. I lay on the straw-covered floor of a barn this morning. I rested only briefly before having another bout of chills, diarrhea, and vomiting. An hour later, we were informed of yet another march, but this time of short duration. We walked a further 3 kilometers. The column came to a halt in a train yard.
As a vital rail hub for the Nazi war effort, Spremberg was considered a prime target by the Allies. 70% of the town was destroyed by Allied bombs and has since been rebuilt. The Third Reich was now unable to cope with the monumental task of feeding and sheltering the 10,000 prisoners of war in one location. The Nazis decided to march the POWs into the Spremberg rail yards, separate the men by nationality, and farm them out across Germany. The Americans are sent south, the rest north.
And finally we got into Spremberg, and then there was just a short march from there to the railroad yards, and then they started putting us in cattle cars.
Dann dort, da stand ein Zug.
There stood a train, a freight train, and they attempted to get into this. It was extremely difficult, for one could see that they were all very tired. Not totally exhausted, but one could see that they had traversed an extremely difficult march. One helped the next. But overall, I felt sorry for them because it was really damp and cold.
The Americans were taken straight south. The Canadians, along with New Zealand and Englanders, were put into cattle cars. Many of them couldn't climb into the cars. They had to be carried in, helped in. Many of them were physically extremely ill. They were not a happy lot. And as the doors were slammed on those cattle cars, nobody had any inkling where the journey was going.
The opportunity for transportation should be a welcome respite from the stresses of marching. Instead, the trains are seen as a premonition of death.
All sorts of rumors went through the ranks. Where are we going? To Buchenwald? To places elsewhere?
And we didn't know where they were going to take us. Buchenwald was about as close to any place as we thought we might even go back there. At least that was in my mind.
Eventually, the train moved off. We had no water, no light, no straw for bedding. About 40 men, crowded in dark confinement. Endurance was our only resource.
They put a bucket of water in the middle of the car, the German. Just a bucket of water. That was gone in 4 or 5 hours, and then that became our latrine. And we were locked in there. Where do you go? You go where you can, and that's in your clothes.
When you had to go, you had to go. So you'd say to your buddies, hey, give me a hand here. And what we'd do would drop our trousers and lean out the window. We were passing through a little town where the villagers were standing on the station watching the train go by. And I can just imagine their feelings when they saw these bare rear ends going by, hanging out the boxcars.
While the prisoners of war fear the Nazi death camps, a more immediate threat is attack from their own comrades.
The Germans did not mark the train with red crosses like you're supposed to do, like the Geneva Convention calls for ambulances and for wounded people and stuff like that. And of course the Allies were still bombing trains. And we felt that if we got on a train that wasn't marked, we'd get splattered.
We had complete air superiority, and anything that moved was fair game for our fighter aircraft.
The Allies saw no better target than a moving train. And so they would descend on it and strafe it. The train would stop. The prisoners in their exhausted state would have to run out and try and hide. What irony for the Germans if American or British or Canadian pilots killed their own flyers.
February 4th. Medically, my luck is holding, proof of which is the absence of any diarrhea since I clambered onto this wretched car. The train squealed to a stop in Tarmstead at 4 p.m. We were in a fit mood to return to the routine of prison camp existence.
8 days after evacuating Stalag Luft 3, Robert Buckham and the other POWs once again find themselves behind Nazi barbed wire, anticipating liberation. Now, hope comes from the west. As days pass, the POWs anxiously follow reports of the rapid Allied advance.
We couldn't understand why it took so long. I mean, that was the odd thing. You'd be convinced that you were going to be released the following day.
All the prisoners, they were just lying on straw mattresses, bare springs, hoping against hope to survive. They knew then the front was not far away. They knew there could be rescue. And after a while, they started hearing the thunder of guns. Montgomery's army, the Second Army, was approaching from the west. Liberation was almost at hand, or would the forced march go on elsewhere?
March 29th. The enervating atmosphere of a prison camp is all-pervading. It penetrates into thoughts, into the spoken word, and into visions. And its palette is gray. The group commanders denied rumors of another march, but nevertheless new packs and a variety of wheeled carts are being produced.
Tanks of the 4th Canadian Armored Div drive across the Dortmund-Ems Canal.
By March 1945, the Third Reich is crumbling. The war will soon be over. Montgomery's troops press forward from the west, Patton's Third Army advances from the south, and Stalin's Red Army marches relentlessly from the east. Yet as the days turn to weeks, there is still no sign of Allied forces outside the prison gates.
Continuing the drive into Germany, armor of the 4th Canadian Div overruns a strong point at Friedeuke.
April 1945, the war reaches endgame. 2 months after the evacuation of Stalag Luft 3, the Allied prisoners of war are scattered across Germany. The POWs are inundated daily with stories of liberating armies sweeping across Europe. Anxiously, they await their own freedom. But despite the rapid disintegration of the once mighty Nazi regime, the POWs are now more than ever in harm's way.
Here was by now the only asset the Third Reich had left. There was nothing left. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and others were not above bargaining their lives for prisoners' lives. And so the whole point of the march was to keep control of these people, to let the Allies know we have about 10,000 pawns. And as the British Army approached the camp at Tarmstadt, the Germans gave the orders to march out of camp, head north, away from the Brits, toward the Danish border.
April 9th, 7:30 p.m. We are waiting to leave camp. The British are only 7 miles from Bremen, and Group Commander Ray is attempting to delay the march, as a single day could be vitally important to our liberation.
The spring march is almost a victory parade for the POWs. With each day, freedom draws closer.
It was a nice walk. It was 100 miles, but it was far easier than that winter march. We could trade for food along the line. Germany was losing the war then. People were getting friendlier by the day, yeah.
I saw guards throwing away his equipment, getting rid of that darn helmet they wore, and they were, I say, we at least felt there was hope at the end of the tunnel. They had, all they could see was that they knew the war was over and that they'd lost it.
April 14th. The guards were in a relaxed mood and trading with the farmhouses en route was widespread. Eggs for breakfast has become a point of pride with us, an edible symbol of our state of semi-freedom. April 22nd. We've heard news of street fighting in Berlin. Churchill says the war is almost over. Our guards have already surrendered. In spirit, if not in fact.
With a German surrender looming, only one question remains for the guards of the prisoners of war: where to wait for the inevitable.
Someone remembered that there was a wonderful old manorial estate owned by the German tobacco king, Philipp Reimtsma, called Trenthorst. They arrived at this farm almost unguarded. They moved into the barns. They set up shop. Mercifully, a last shipment of Red Cross boxes came down from Lübeck, so they were replenished here.
We're all kept on this big estate, enjoying life as much as we could. And they had some trout ponds there full of fish. And we tried to catch them on a makeshift hook and line, but it wasn't too successful until someone had the bright idea. They'd bribed a guard and got a couple of hand grenades. And we threw those in the pond, and of course we had fish come to the top. It was terrific. Fresh trout for breakfast.
Liberation is still days away for the Canadians and British sequestered in the north. For American captives to the south in Moosburg, freedom will come only after a fight between their liberators and the fanatic SS.
As the Russians were putting an iron circle around Berlin, the absolute leading lights of the SS, the highest leaders as they called them, decided they would not prefer to be captured by the Red Army. They split into two groups, each 400 to 500. One group went south. Another group decided to head for the Danish border. The ring was closing from all sides. They were settling accounts at this time with fellow Germans, with people they didn't like. They were murdering their own people left and right, standing them up against the wall and shooting them.
The SS would not give up. Now the Luftwaffe, they had moved all their people out, but a major and a few guards to take care of us and turn us over to the American authorities. They got there. Well, the SS didn't want any of that. Matter of fact, they shot one of the majors of the Luftwaffe while we were there because he wouldn't come out and get on this railroad embankment and help defend from Patton. The pathetic part of it is when Patton attacked, and we could hear the bullets coming through, some of the guys, and unfortunately some of the people had been in prison for years, some of the earlier RAF guys out of Stalag Luft 3 that just could not resist raising up to see, and I know that one or two got shot. All those years a prisoner, and within a few seconds of being liberated, got shot by their own forces because they didn't stay down. I stayed down.
We heard the firefight. As we drew closer, it was like thunder in the springtime in Kansas, you know, coming closer and closer.
American soldiers dash to a prison camp. Is the gate locked? Shoot it out. They're eager to liberate American comrades, knowing how brutally prisoners of war have been treated. They're an armored unit, and are they welcome? This is the hour the prisoners have been dreaming of. They're received with hugs and kisses.
Almost immediately, The American troops were there, and right at the front of the American troops was Patton. Oh, I'm telling you, he was the greatest looking guy you ever saw. I climbed up on that truck with those big silver-handled revolvers, and him big already, and he started talking to us. Then he apologized for being late getting there to liberate us.
It was a great day. Most tremendous day of my life, because it's freedom.
As Patton continues his liberation through the German heartland, Montgomery's army sweeps across North Germany until it finally reaches the Canadian and British POWs at the Trenthorst estate.
May 2nd, 1945. We are free. The morning brought rumors that the 11th Division of Montgomery's 2nd Army was in Lubeck. At 5:20, an armored tank appeared on the road, clattering out of the smoke as it approached the camp.
The Germans were falling back, and we had one lot come through, and we asked, where are our troops? And he said, Tommy, come. Tommy's coming.
Well, out of the blue came this little reconnaissance car, like a Jeep with an officer and a soldier driving it.
I mean, he couldn't liberate anything, but it was an advanced reconnaissance vehicle, small reconnaissance vehicle, and the chap was mobbed.
British officer steps out and said, well, you chaps, he said, we've been looking for you. Just sit tight and we'll be along to pick you up with some lorries.
And the German commandant went through the formality of handing in all their arms, and that was the end of it.
A roar of cheers, crudely made flags waving, laughter and tears mingling, men climbing the wire to run to the tanks, men embracing each other, shouting incoherently, men kneeling to pray, men staring vacantly, bewildered. Thousands of men in a state of hysterical, blessed release.
And I have a drawing, which I did just at that moment. Just a scratch I was doing, but it was a way of expressing my feelings at the time. I couldn't have drawn anything more detailed than that. I was too excited. Everyone else was crying. A lot of them were crying. I was crying myself as I was drawing. It was, if you want emotion, it's hidden there, and it's very near the surface right now.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
This march is one of the great untold stories of the Second World War. Miraculously, only a few of the 10,000 POWs died during those 3 turbulent months in 1945. For the men thrust into a winter hell, what could have been a march towards certain death instead became a march to freedom.
May 9th. Yesterday, Eisenhower and Montgomery were somewhere in the area signing a peace treaty. We found a magnificent party at the local airfield. The CO greeted us by tossing a bottle of champagne to each. The party finally exhausted itself in the smoke from a huge swastika flag burning on the floor. This morning, we embarked on a DC-3 for the flight to England. We landed at Guildford just in time for tea. I was guided into a tent where a donut was placed in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. A motherly woman appeared before me. "How are you, lad?" I stared at her mutely, but I was smiling.